Welcome, everyone. So welcome back to those who have been following the series for some time, and welcome to those who are new to the series. So this is the third segment in our Mind Matter series at Mind and Life Europe of 2025. And for those who've been following the series, you will know that we have chosen to inflect it with a particular theme, and we've done this in the past with our Gaia focus, the Gaia theme. And so this year's special inflection or theme, if you will, is arts and inaction. And the way we phrased it in our language has been arts and aesthetics in the inactive fold. So it's just one of the many ways that we're examining, we're exploring the ways in which artistic and aesthetic experience, practice, and process has a great deal of affinity, sometimes unseen, sometimes articulated, sometimes unarticulated, with the many other threads of our work. So the scientific, the philosophical, and particularly our work grounded in the inactive tradition. And so whether or not the speakers that we've had in this series are specifically coming from the inactive tradition, we've been able to follow some of those threads and some of these affinities and really go more deeply into the process of artistic practice itself. And so we're so delighted to have a special friend of Mind and Life Europe and special guest this evening coming back for another talk in this particular series to talk about a somewhat lesser known aspect of his work. Welcome to Stephen Batchelor. I would really like to join you, and I wanted to, before we give you the floor, I just wanted to introduce you. So for those who don't know your work as well, we can give a little bit of context for your talk this evening. So Stephen Batchelor is a contemporary Buddhist teacher and writer, best known for his secular or agnostic approach to Buddhism. Stephen considers Buddhism to be a constantly evolving culture of awakening rather than a religious system based on immutable dogmas and beliefs. In particular, he regards the doctrines of karma and rebirth to be features of ancient Indian civilization and not intrinsic to what the Buddha taught. Buddhism has survived for the past 2,500 years because of its capacity to reinvent itself in accord with the needs of the different societies with which it has creatively interacted throughout its history. Through his writings, translations, and teaching, of which there are many, I'd encourage you to just take a look at the different books he's published over the years. Stephen engages in a critical exploration of Buddhism's role in the modern world, which has earned him both condemnation as a heretic and praise as a reformer. His latest book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us, Ethical Living in Uncertain Times, was just published in the press in August of this year. So anyone who hasn't read Stephen's incredibly articulate work on ethics, on secular Buddhism, I'd really encourage you to go look up some of the titles. The Art of Solitude, I also recommend. So with that, Stephen Batchelor, I just want to thank you again for sharing your time and your voice and some of your insights with us, specifically about imagination, creativity, and art.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank all of you who make Mind and Life Europe what it is for these programs that I've really enjoyed being part of over the last few years. So this presentation is called Imagination, Creativity and Art. And I will be looking at this from within a Buddhist perspective. Ever since I was very young, and this to some extent had to do with my family background, imagination and creativity have always been very, very important for me. And as a young person, I actually aspired to be a photographer, an artist. That was the direction in which I wanted my life to go. Also a writer. All of those ambitions were ones that I nurtured as a teenager. And I think I've always seen them as integral elements of what I would now call a flourishing life, a life in which I feel most fully alive. Without imagination and creativity, I can't really understand how I would actually flourish in this world as an ethical and as an aesthetic, an ethical, and I guess one could say an artistic person drawn to that approach. Inevitably, then, when I got involved in Buddhism, I was very curious to know what role imagination and creativity play in the practice of the Dharma. And I was fully aware, as I'm sure we all are, that Buddhist cultures throughout the world, primarily in Asia, have produced extraordinary works of art. You only have to go to Thailand or India or Tibet, and you will see the most extraordinary paintings, architecture, sculptures, literature, poetry. So there's no shortage of art in Buddhist cultures. But I never could come across any discussion as to how art was made, whether art played a role in the practice of the Dharma, and whether, in fact, Buddhist thought even had a place for imagination and creativity. In fact, for many years, I had the impression that there were no equivalent terms in classic Buddhist languages, Pali or Sanskrit or Tibetan, for the concepts of imagination and creativity. I never came across them in the texts that I studied. They didn't seem to play a particular role. Over the past few years, however, and this has been largely as a result of looking in some detail and also somewhat critically to the earliest Buddhist texts that we find in the Pali canon and in other traditions as well. But I spent a lot of time going back to the earliest sources we have in order to try to get a better sense of who the human person of the Buddha was, and also to try to recognize what seemed to be the core values and virtues and ideas that animated the life of that early community. So recently, I've come to believe that actually early Buddhism and all the Buddhist traditions that come from that do in fact value imagination and creativity. I think they're even considered to be some of the key virtues that there are. So what I want to do this evening is to sort of try to justify that, to explain to you why I think imagination and creativity are there in traditional Buddhism, but somehow invisible. Somehow they've been marginalized or suppressed, perhaps, but they're not central to any presentation of Buddhism that we would traditionally come across. I guess it's really not so much that imagination and creativity are absent, but rather that they have never been properly theorized. Now, we know full well that, let's take, for example, mindfulness. Mindfulness is definitely present in the early and all Buddhist traditions, but it has been very expertly theorized. There is a very rich literature that makes sense of what mindfulness is. But imagination and creativity have never reached that level of prominence in the broader Buddhist imaginary, as we might say. So let's first of all look at the imagination, or imagination. I'm sure we all have our own particular ideas about it. We might have thought about it quite a bit. We might even have come up with some quite precise psychological definitions of imagination. But I'd like to start really with, not with definitions or a kind of analytical approach to the imagination, but to see imagination as it is enacted. And I think in all of the spiritual traditions of the world, I think we find this enactment of the imagination most vividly in parables and allegories. And so we may be coming from the Socratic tradition, and we'll be aware of the allegory of the cave. that we find in Plato in Book 7 of the Republic. And this is so well known, I don't really need to say much about it, but basically it's about an image of a bunch of people stuck in a cave who are looking at a wall against which are projected the shadows of beings who are in the background behind them at the entrance of the cave. And all that the people in the cave regard as reality are these shadowy figures on the wall in front of them, and they're completely fixated by that. But then you have some aspiring philosopher, let's say, amongst these people who says, well, wait a minute, where is all this coming from? And so the philosopher turns around away from the wall, heads for the entrance to the cave, which is some distance away, and then goes out into the real world, as it were, and finds it filled with light and color and shape and richness and the glory of nature that had been entirely absent in the cave. I first came across the allegory of the cave when I was about 16 or 17 years old, and it stuck with me. It said something without actually having to explain anything. And that's the power of allegory. And likewise, when I encountered Buddhism in India in the early 70s, although we were studying Tibetan Buddhist texts that taught the stages of the path and different things like that, I was also reading books in English on Buddhism that were around amongst our community there. And I was struck by the fact that in many of these introductory books, they started with some of the Buddha's parables. The parable of the arrow, the poisoned arrow, where a person has been shot by a poisoned arrow, but he refuses to let anybody take the arrow out until he knows exactly the name of the person who shot it and what kind of feathers were used on the arrow's flesh and so forth and so on. In other words, an absurd situation, but one in which a great deal can be communicated. And what's being communicated basically is that the important thing is not to know who shot the arrow. The important thing is to remove the arrow. In other words, this is a parable about effectively the pragmatic nature of the Dharma. It's not about theorizing what it is that causes the problem. It's about actually addressing the problem in the way that a doctor might. In other words, actually removing the source of the suffering. It's largely believed by biblical scholars and other scholars of religion that parables very often seem to point to a very early period in the evolution of a particular tradition. We find the same, of course, in Christianity. When you read the New Testament, one of the things that strikes all of us, I'm sure, is the skill that Jesus had in communicating his message, not by theological doctrines, which come along much later, but by parables. In other words, he takes examples like the mustard seed or the woman in adultery or many, many others, takes ordinary life situations and then turns them imaginatively into a teaching, into what he is trying to communicate as central to his vision. I'm going to be reading some passages from my new book, which is this one called Buddha, Socrates and Us. And I am rather shamelessly, perhaps, going to be promoting this book throughout this talk. But happily, the themes of imagination and creativity are very much discussed in this book. And so it's not entirely inappropriate. I'm just going to read a passage here about parables. Parables speak to the imagination. In presenting brief, dramatic human stories situated in recognizable settings, a parable evokes what it's like to encounter and resolve an existential conflict. Through identifying with the character in the story, the listener or reader can picture herself facing the same dilemma. She is thereby enabled to ponder the deeper ethical or philosophical issues that the parable seeks to address. By speaking in pictures, the parable reveals the multifaceted, temporal, and interpersonal quality of human situations. You only have to hear a parable once to understand it. And once understood, you do not easily forget either the story or its moral. It stays with you. Yet you find it difficult to explain adequately in words what you have understood. As time goes by, you discover how parables have an uncanny ability to keep casting fresh light on your life, no matter how much you and your world have changed. So the parable is something that is only able to work because of our imagination. In other words, our capacity to picture the situation, the scenario, and to, as it were, visualize and see enacted particular things that are going on in that story that then convey to us some truth. And usually a truth that, if it speaks to us, remains with us. Now, the word that I think is used in early Buddhism for imagination is sankappa, Sankappa in Pali, or samkalpa in Sanskrit. And normally this word is translated either as thought, or nowadays it's often translated as intention. It's rarely, if ever, translated as imagination, even though the Pali dictionary does in fact give that as one option. And where we come across this in traditional Buddhism is as the second step in the traditional Eightfold Path. We have right view, then right thought, or as it's often translated now, right intention. Personally, I find that thought and intention do not capture what this term sankappa seems to suggest. When we look at the term itself, we find that it comes from the root verb kapeti. And kapeti in Pali means to create, to build, to construct, to arrange, to prepare, to order. It doesn't say anything at all about thought. It doesn't say anything at all about intentional, although, of course, imagination could be said to include both. But the term sankappa, I think, is better presented as imagination. Another passage from the book, and this is my attempt, as it were, to try to at least describe how I understand imagination as briefly as I can. Imagination is the human capacity to picture ourselves situations, things, and people who are not physically present or don't even exist, such as characters in a play or a novel. In responding to an ethical or moral dilemma, we may spend days and weeks agonizing over a response as we imagine the consequences that could result from what we say or do. Without imagination, we would be unable to picture how other persons might feel about the same dilemma and how they may be impacted by what we say and do. Imagination, therefore, is essential for empathy, our ability to sense what it is like to be in another's shoes, to experience a conflict from their perspective other than our own. So, imagination has this capacity, as it were, to take us out of ourselves, to put ourselves in the situation of others, to imagine what the consequences of our actions might be, to be able to play out different scenarios to arrive at a judgment as to what would be the most appropriate thing to do. It's impossible to think ethically without engaging the imagination. And at the same time, and again, this is going back to the book, imagination allows us to engage with the myths, the archetypes, the symbols that constitute the great narratives of human cultures. Without imagination, we would be unable to shape our lives in the light of what is preserved in the imaginaries of our families, our tribes, our nations, religions, and so on. Without imagination, we would be unable to envisage a future. And of course, imagination is also essential for creativity, which is what we're going to look at now. Imagination arguably is the medium within which creativity stirs and begins to move, just as air is the medium in which a bird will take flight. So let's move on to creativity. Now, in my current understanding, flagging the fact that this, of course, might change, Iddhipada, the word for creativity in Buddhism, I would argue, is the word iddhi, or iddhi in Pali. And that's usually translated as psychic power or magical power. And I remember very early on in my study of Buddhism, when we'd been presented the four mindfulnesses and the four kinds of resolve that we were encouraged to develop, the next step on the path was to cultivate the four psychic powers. And that struck me as rather strange, as rather odd. And I'll read you just the standard stock passage that describes these psychic powers. Having been one, he becomes many. Having been many, he becomes one. He appears, he vanishes. He goes unimpeded through walls, ramparts, and mountains as if through space. He dives in and out of the water, he dives in and out of the earth as if it were water. He walks on water without sinking, as if it were dry land. Sitting cross-legged, he flies through the air like a winged bird. With his hand, he touches and strokes even the sun and the moon. Now, all the Buddhist traditions I've come across take that literally, that once you achieve certain high degrees of meditation, then this will grant you these psychic powers that will enable you to perform all of these sort of magical tricks, basically. What it doesn't do in the, if we look at the study or the texts that relate to this, you don't have any explanation whatsoever as to how you might manage to walk through ramparts and mountains. It also doesn't explain what the point of that would be. Okay, let's imagine, for example, that I can walk through a wall. Well, so what? It would challenge a lot of basic physics, and there might be some value in that, but it would not actually, to me, serve any value at all in practicing the Dharma, in cultivating ethics, contemplation, and wisdom. And the Buddha himself, in other passages, often talks of these things as though they were just conjurers' tricks. And the only true miracle, he says, is the miracle of being able to offer instruction, to be able to use words to instruct and explain to people how they can change their minds, how they can transform themselves from confused, selfish people into magnanimous, altruistic beings. That's magic, says the Buddha. But this other stuff, walking on water and so on, is basically just a conjurer's trick, he says. But nonetheless, we find this passage repeated again and again and again and again. I've never found any explanation, as I said, as to why it's there, what it means or what its value is. It's just kept intact. There is, however, one text where the Buddha gives a metaphor for creativity, what I would call creativity. Just as a skilled potter, he said, can craft whatever kind of pottery vessel he likes, or a skilled ivory carver can craft any kind of ivory work he likes, or a skilled goldsmith can craft any kind of gold article he likes. In the same way, with his mind thus collected, purified, malleable, radiant, and steady, the practitioner directs and inclines it to forms of creativity. Or, as it's usually translated, inclines it to psychic powers. But let's stick with creativity. So take, for example, an artisan. It could be a potter, it could be a goldsmith. First of all, you have a raw material, a lump of clay, an elephant's tusk, or liquid gold. And this raw material can then be transformed into something functional and beautiful. In other words, when the person has achieved a degree of stillness, of focus, of clarity of mind, that is the condition in which they can imagine what it is that they would like to create. And like the ivory carver first imagines the work that he or she wants to create and then sets out to do so. And if we translate that into the language of the dharma of Buddhism, then the imagination, the creativity would be about recognizing the kind of person you aspire to be and then figuring out what would be the most effective steps to take in my life whereby I could more and more approximate the kind of person that I aspire to be. And there is something somewhat magical about this, how we are ourselves we often think of ourselves as sort of, I'm like this or I'm like that. What this practice is somehow teaching us is to say, well, that is only one configuration of what you could be. You need to pursue a series of steps that will lead you to further growth in terms of your person or in terms of a skill you have, your refinement of that skill to produce ever increasingly beautiful and functional objects. Now, this creativity in the classic texts is described as occurring within 4 steps. Gautama speaks of the 4 steps of creativity. So he doesn't see creativity just as a kind of a single mental function. He sees it as a process. And this process involves these 4 steps: aspiration, perseverance, intuition, and experimentation. Aspiration, perseverance, intuition, and experimentation. So let's take, for example, a potter. First of all, the potter has to imagine a work that she aspires to create that so far only exists in her imagination. But you must have some vision, some even a very vague idea of what it is you seek to create. You must aspire to do that. There must be a longing, a desire to create that thing. Then you need the process of continuing to work at whatever steps are required to bring that thing into being. And this requires a degree of commitment, a degree of dedication. And anyone who's done any kind of work, particularly in the arts, is familiar with this process. You can have the wonderful painting you want to paint, but then you've got to figure out how to do it. You also, in this process, need to let go of some of your conceptual preferences, perhaps ideas of aesthetics that you have inherited from your family or your culture or whatever, and seek to somehow break through the deadlock of some of these rather well-known, somewhat sclerotic perhaps, aesthetic assumptions. If we're going to really create beauty in the world that is not derivative or just repeating what's been done in the past, we have to learn to trust our aesthetic intuitions for guidance in creating the work. So we start with a longing or an aspiration. We then work away at that. But then we get to a point where we get an intuition, a flash, a sudden moment of insight. It might be we wake up in the middle of the night and, that's what I have to do. Something that arises as a result of struggling to achieve what you wish to do. But you need breakthroughs. You need moments in which you suddenly get it, what it is that needs to be done. But even then, you have to keep on experimenting, because it's only through making pots that fall short of the potter's ideal that the potter arrives, often by serendipity, by accident, at the kind of pot she intuitively knows to be right, the one that she's aiming for. And I think we can translate that process into the practice of meditation, say, so that the practitioner likewise makes a sustained effort to become the kind of person she aspires to be. And she has to trust the intuitions of her heart and soul to guide her along the path. And then she needs to keep experimenting with different approaches and practices in order to discover what works for her. Now, I can not find any information in classical Buddhist literature that explains what aspiration, perseverance, intuition, and experimentation have to do with attaining psychic powers like walking on water. It doesn't seem to fit at all. And so I spent some time working out this interpretation of these 4 steps of creativity. And then, by chance, actually, I was Googling something or other, and a result came up that talked about 4 stages of creativity. And this was a theory developed by the British social psychologist Graham Wallace, who I've never heard of, in the 1920s, more than 100 years ago. And what I was struck by is that his 4 stages of creativity map fairly well onto the 4 stages of creativity that I've found within these Buddhist texts. It's also striking, I think, that Wallace also has 4 stages. It's as though the number 4 seems to be in common with the 2. That seems to have something to do with this process. But Wallace doesn't exactly agree with Buddhism here. Instead of aspiration, he talks of preparation, which is not light years away. It's getting ready to do something, preparing oneself for the task, for what you seek to create. The second step is not perseverance, as we find in Buddhism, but it's incubation. Incubation. In other words, we need to keep ourselves focused on our goal of what we seek to create, be that our own development, our own spiritual development, or be it the making of a pot. And by just allowing those ideas to somehow be nurtured unconsciously, maybe when we're asleep. And I think nowadays, this would certainly have been what he was referring to, is this unconscious neural processing that goes on in the brain. And then at some point gives rise to the third of his 4 steps, which is illumination. Again, very similar to the Buddhist intuition. Illumination, intuition. And then once one has had that moment of aha, then you can move much more confidently to testing which particular ways of making this thing or realizing this intuition or illumination will work the best. And Wallace calls that verification. I call it testing. So you can see that this looks very much like the same territory, at least. Perhaps the one that seems the most at odds with the Buddhist model is incubation. What does incubation have to do with perseverance? It almost seems disconnected. But let's step back for a moment and look at how Buddhism understands perseverance. In fact, there are many words in Buddhist texts. We find effort, we find perseverance, we find resolve, and there are different words in Pali and Sanskrit and Tibetan as well. But they always define them in the same way. That perseverance is not, as we would habitually understand it in English, or an English-speaking world, as somehow pushing yourself, urging yourself onwards. That might be part of it. But the Buddha understands perseverance or effort or resolve as about creating the conditions under which the desired result will arise. So if you want, for example, to become wise, then you create the conditions, training yourself in mindfulness, in concentration, in study, in debate, and so on, all of the things that will be the conditions that in the course of time will hopefully generate wisdom. Or we could think of compassion and the practices we might do to develop more compassion. So in some ways, perseverance is overdetermined. It suggests a kind of forcing oneself to do something. Whereas in fact, it's actually much more about creating conditions in the course of time over your life that will have the consequence of giving rise to the results that you wish, and also by desisting in doing other things, by not giving rise to those qualities of mind like hatred or greed or whatever that get in the way of your achieving your goals. Now, if we think of perseverance in that way, then it actually starts to sound more and more like incubation. And as we would fortunately have it, there is in fact a discourse in the numerical discourses of the Buddha, and it's called the Bhavana Sutta, which literally means the discourse on cultivation. The discourse on cultivation. This word cultivation is bhavana in Pali and Sanskrit, and it literally means to bring something into being. To bring something into being, which of course is very close to our word to create something, to give birth to something. But strangely, and we can maybe look at this more in the discussion, nowadays bhavana in all Buddhist communities, whether it's in Sri Lanka or whether it's in Tibet, has come to simply mean meditation. In Tibetan, bhavana was translated as gom, which means, for most Tibetans, it means to meditate, which literally means to sort of get used to something, train yourself in something, become familiar. But its idea is very much to do with meditation. Same in the Theravada countries as well. So bhavana cultivation has been reduced primarily to becoming proficient in meditative skills. But in the Bhavana Sutta, this text on cultivation, the Buddha starts by saying, and what is it, monks, that is to be cultivated? And then he lists all the virtues, the 4 mindfulnesses, the 4 resolves, the 4 steps of creativity, the 5 powers, the 7 factors of awakening, and the Eightfold Path, the 32 primary or core virtues of the Dharma. And all of these qualities are to be cultivated. Again, the word meditation wouldn't work here. Some of them are meditative, of course they are, But there's many, like the steps of creativity, for example, or imagination, that are not to do entirely just with meditation. The Buddha then provides a metaphor to explain how this cultivation takes place. Again, the power of the parable comes to mind. He says, imagine you have a chicken, and the chicken has a clutch of 4 or 6 or 8 eggs. And the chicken, or the mother hen really, sits on the eggs, and then with her feet, she moves the eggs around beneath her in such a way that they maintain the same temperature, that they're all equally being nurtured and cared for in the same way, such that they will ripen, or they will hatch, I'm sorry, at the same time. But the job of the hen is to constantly be adjusting the position of the eggs such that none of them will, as it were, get left out, or will get too cold and might even die. So creativity, in this sense, is very much about creating or bringing something into being. And the metaphor that we're using here, that of the little chick, is to give birth to something new. So not only does bhavana have a very strong sense of creating, bringing something to being, creativity, the 4 steps of creativity that we were looking at actually give us a much more precise breakdown of what bhavana, cultivation, means. It means that there is a longing for a certain result. There is an incubation of that quality, or we might, or as the Buddhists would call it, creating the conditions for that to arise. In other words, to make an effort. It has to do likewise with moments of insight, of intuition, and it has to do with trying out different approaches that will finally result in what you aspire for. So that, I hope, gives you some sense of how we might understand imagination and creativity from a traditional Buddhist perspective, qualities that I had initially thought of as absent in the Dharma can be discovered there, assuming my interpretation of these terms is valid. I'm sure most Buddhist scholars may not agree, but nonetheless, I feel there is a fairly strong case that can be made, and I make this case throughout my book, that imagination and creativity need to be somehow restored to the idea of what it means to practice the Dharma. That rather than putting so much emphasis on contemplation, on meditation, we need to think of our practice just as much as being about how we use our imagination, how we enact our values through our imagination, how we reach out to solve problems, both personal and those in the world, through creativity, through thinking outside the box, as we might say, of getting an insight into a solution that has never quite been thought of in that way before. In other words, rather than being marginal qualities that just have to do with artists who paint tankas and so on, it has to do with the very nature of the practice that we're involved in. But why then have imagination and creativity been sidelined, ignored, or we might even feel have been suppressed to some extent in traditional Buddhism? You only have to look at traditional Buddhist art. If you think of Tibetan tankas or mandalas, or if you think of Zen calligraphy, these traditional forms of art are highly formulaic. dogmatic. In other words, they're based on pre-existing models, on grids, which you have to trace very exactly. And the idea is to reproduce the image of, let's say, Avalokiteshvara, exactly as it's always been done since time immemorial. And even Zen calligraphy, which we think of as just being rapid brushstrokes and so on, which looks very spontaneous and immediate. When you actually train in calligraphy or brush painting in East Asia, you actually, again, have a very clear model that you have to conform to, a very specific number of brush strokes that you have to make in order that it could be, it can qualify as representing an orchid or a particular ideogram or whatever it might be. So there is that tendency that it's very conservative, very predictable, and very much the same. And of course, when you look carefully at these forms of art, you can see with a bit of practice that sometimes there's really an artist at work here, and at other times there's just a journeyman woman who has just copied something else. Fortunately, today, there are Buddhist artists within these traditions. In the Tibetan tradition, I can think of, what's his name? Gelwa Gyatso, I think, and another Tibetan artist who are now, as it were, experimenting with their traditional forms of Tibetan art. They're still using some of the same images, the same techniques, but they've now in a way transforming it into a visual language that speaks far more to our contemporary situation. And likewise, you'll find the same in Zen. But nonetheless, if we take it outside the preserve of art, then if we look in terms of Buddhist practice and teaching in the more traditional settings, then there's very little, if any, encouragement to be imaginative or creative. There's far more emphasis on staying true to the instructions and the teachings that have been handed down over centuries, and these must be very, very carefully preserved and guarded so that they're not in any way at risk of being lost or corrupted. That is all very well, and I feel that that is not a bad argument. I think there is, of course, something true in that, but and here I fear we're getting to the point, the imagination and creativity have within them danger. They are a threat to any status quo or orthodoxy. If your job as a Buddhist teacher or as a political figure or whatever is to maintain your tradition as it has always been maintained, and to remain true to the core values and principles of what you're teaching, then you don't then want in the next thing you say to encourage imagination and creativity. Because this is not about preserving a status quo. It's not about just doing the same thing that orthodoxy has repeated over centuries. It's about bringing to bear your own deeply felt needs and values and longings to realize a way of life that speaks to you most directly and most immediately in the context of the world in which we live now. And historically, I think Buddhism has managed to reinvent itself, reimagine itself, to creatively engage with societies and cultures quite alien to those under which it grew up in ancient India, like China or Japan or Tibet, and has reconfigured itself. And I think this illustrates the intrinsic, imaginative and creative power of the Dharma itself. Curiously, most traditions in Asia, in Tibet or China, insist that what they're teaching is what comes down from the Buddha. But from an historical critical perspective, we know quite well that actually Tibetan Buddhism has imaginatively transformed what it received from India in a way that speaks more appropriately and directly to people living in Tibet. Now, what this has meant in many ways is that imagination is okay if you are a high lama or a Zen master or something, or if you were thinking in terms of the overall tradition surviving through time. But it really doesn't offer any particular encouragement to the ordinary man or woman who is trying to figure out how to live their lives through the practice of Buddhism. Many years ago, I, I wrote an essay called A Democracy of the Imagination. This is included in my collected essays published under the title Secular Buddhism, also published by Yale. And what I tried to do in this essay was to try to recognize that the imagination, that all of us as practitioners of the Dharma are people with imaginations. And imagination should not just be the preserve of the people in authority, but imagination should be valorized as an incredibly important dimension of our own inner life and our capacity to transform and to imagine a world other than the one that we may be oppressed by or suffering from right now. And some years after that, I was invited to be part of a program at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts, in which they brought together for 4 or 5 days Dharma teachers and practitioners who were also practicing artists. And one of the things that led to this gathering was that some of us began to recognize that one thing that the Dharma or Buddhism and art have in common is that they are both practices. You practice the Dharma and you practice art. And that, I think, is the point that keeps them in common. I myself am a practicing artist. I work with collage, photography, but primarily with collage. But what this has meant to me is how my Dharma practice, in many ways, is modeled on my art practice. The art practice is a practice in which I've been pursuing with collage for 30 years or more now. I just do one at a time, and each one then becomes the seed of the next one. And I have to, as it were, incubate, persevere to get an intuition as to what the next work will be, the next collage will be. And then I go ahead and do it. And this sometimes takes weeks, months to do. It's a very slow process, but it's one in which has made me intimately familiar with these 4 steps of creativity as I've described them. Collage work is very, very important to me. I'll actually show you one of my collages. I don't know whether you can see it clearly. Maybe there. I know that's too close to the camera. Let's put it there. It's about, well, you can see it's hiding my face. It's about 8 inches square, I would guess. And it has 32 pieces. All of the pieces are found materials. They're all in the primary colors of red, yellow, blue, and white. And they're organized by chance operations. And that particular collage is actually a visual representation of my book, The Art of Solitude. And in writing this book, for the first time, I began to use the same methods I use in making collages to organize the chapters of a book. In other words, to arrange the chapters of the book according to the way in which certain colors come out of a bag when I present them to another person to select them. And the sequence of colors then dictates the sequence of chapters. It's a bit weird, but it's a practice I've been doing now for some time. And I find that my approach to writing is becoming more and more collage-like. the book Buddha, Socrates, and Us. It's not so strictly done as in that last one, but still it's very much organized along those same kind of principles. I've also begun more and more to represent certain Buddhist sets of values in a collage type form. But perhaps more importantly than making art, collage, photographs, books, the practice of creativity and imagination has to do with the work one does on oneself. And I like to think, again, following the art metaphor, is that my dharma practice, my spiritual practice, my religious practice has to do with working with the raw materials of my body, my mind, my feelings, my emotions, my ideas. And Buddhism provides us with all kinds of strategies and methodologies whereby to transmute or to reorganize or to investigate the constant flow of inner and outer images and sensations and feelings that constitutes our life. So in that sense, I see my whole being as being like clay or paint or bits of found material I use for collage. And my practice is one about constantly refining these qualities, not just to get a better conceptual understanding of them, but actually more and more to create something of beauty. That art and creativity and imagination are very much tied up in my mind with aesthetics. What looks right, what looks good, what sounds right. Very difficult to define what that is. But as you work in the arts, as you work as a writer, over the years, you refine that aesthetic judgment to say, this is where the sentence stops. This is where that bit of paper goes next to that one, and so on. And if we were to extrapolate this even further, we could argue that a secular Buddhist or simply a Buddhist or a Dharmic community could also consider developing itself and evolving itself, likewise in terms that drawing more from the arts than from, say, sociology or science, that we could imagine another kind of society, which in fact the Buddha did in the parable of the city, which some of you may be familiar with, which was very much about imagining the rebuilding of a ruined city. And he saw that as very much how the Dharma, how his Dharma, what his Dharma was about. And he also thought of the Eightfold Path as the path that leads to the restoration of a city rather than a path that leads to the end of suffering. So I've spoken longer than I really wanted to, but we now have a half an hour, and I'd be very happy at this point to try and answer any questions you might have or any comments you would like to make. So you can either, in fact, I think, Joanna, do you want to just?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I can us into the discussion. So like Stephen said, we've got about half an hour. I'm going to say about 27, 28 minutes. If you have a question or a comment or an experience you want to share, the best way I think is to raise your hand, your virtual hand. We can see you then. You come to the front of the room and then you can just unmute yourself. Or you can leave a comment or a question in the chat if you can't unmute yourself, and then we can read that out. So I see Stephen Nakmanovich has already got his hand raised.
Hi, Stephen. Are you have switch? You're muted, Stephen?
Let's unmute. Okay. Thank you, Stephen, so much. This is an amazing talk, and I have so much fellow feeling for what you're doing. Um, One of the things near the end that struck me was the idea that it's rare in Buddhist artistic traditions for people to be really creative or really original. And most of the practitioners of art in Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, and so forth. We're following patterns that were given by tradition. But I think this is actually true of any artistic tradition. If you look at Western classical music or Western pop music or Western rock and roll, the vast majority of artists are following templates, doing what's considered acceptable according to theory, doing what they think the audience wants or what they think their teachers wants or what the middlemen want. And it's relatively few who really jump up and produce something that is really of them and really original and really originates from them. And um, to me, that's an act. We tend to use, because we're speaking English, we use nouns like creativity or imagination, but I don't think these nouns exist. I think that sometimes you're creating, and it's a verb. Sometimes you're creating, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're imagining, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're talking, sometimes you're not. And anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
No, I think you're quite right. Certainly, I mean, the very idea of creativity, arts, and so on does, I think, for most people, um, does not lead them to want to become a highly original artist. I mean, we're a little bit wary also about the idea of originality too, not to make too big a deal out of that. But I think perhaps why this has become a pressing issue for me, and again, I'm the only person I can really speak about with any authority, is because I think Buddhism is at a turning point. I think most religions are at a turning point. I think we're at a point where Buddhism has flourished for more than 2,500 years, primarily in Asia. And now it's landed very quickly and very abruptly into post-modernity, basically. And we find ourselves in a situation which is very, very different to the one in which Buddhism traditionally was practiced and developed. And this has given rise to tension. There are some who say we must just keep the tradition just as it was, and that won't encourage creativity. But there are others who feel that, a lot of what we're teaching is not working in this culture. They don't believe half these things. We've got to adapt it to suit Western teachers. And I don't think it's only radicals who are, trying to do that. But I think this is an experience that's common to anyone who's tried to explain Buddhism to a non-Buddhist audience. So that in itself, gives rise to questions like, well, how could we imagine this in a slightly different way? And there'll be some who want to sort of modify and reform certain elements or leave certain bits out, but there might be others, and I would include myself amongst those who have given my life to this tradition, and I feel there's quite some urgency in finding another way to configure the basic logic of the Dharma in such a
Mm,
way that it is addressing more directly and appropriately the needs of people today.
yeah.
Yes, so that would be where I would leave it. So I think that's the reason I accept your point. It's valid. It confirms actually what I've been saying in many ways. And it also, I think, helps explain why when you do think too much outside the box, then the heavy weight of orthodoxy comes crashing down on your head, and you find yourself you're suddenly very unpopular. Now, why is that? Why is that? And I think I'll leave that as a question.
Yes.
Vega, Vegar, what's your point?
Hi there. Well, first of all, I just want to say that as a long-time Zen practitioner, I've read a couple of your books, and I'm just deeply appreciative of the work that you've done to um, take Buddhism further. So thank you for that. Very appreciative. And I have several questions, but I'll keep it short. My Some of it was covered by Stephen,
Hmm.
so that was good. I'm wondering if I'll see if I can squeeze in two. I'm wondering if you could say something about the upaya, if that relates to what you've been talking about so far.
Mhm.
And
Can
also,
we do that first? I,
sorry.
can we do that one
Yes,
first?
go for it. Thank you.
Upaya is a term that I think is very much in this ballpark. I mean, upaya, which is not so much upaya, but upaya kaushala, which is sometimes translated as skillful means. But actually, if you look at it closely, the word actually means being skilled in means, being skilled in methodology. It's tap la kepa, skilled in something. So the emphasis not so much on upaya, means, but having skill in means. And yes, in that sense, I think that's another very good term that would likewise recognize the necessity for imagination and creativity, because basically to be skilled in methods, whatever they might be, in whichever field, requires using developing these skills through one's imagination. The upaya kausala is not such a central virtue, particularly in early Buddhism. It's there in the early texts, but it doesn't figure on the main sort of lists of primary virtues. So I would leave it somewhat to the side, but no, it's a good point, and I think it is very much along this. It's in this same camp. Thank you. And the next question, one more, and then we'll move.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could say something about, China around the 10th century, the birth of landscape painting, intimately tied with Zen arriving to China, and it seems like there was a blossoming around that time of poetry, of different kinds of visual arts. Uh, is that an exception, as you see it, to this sort of view on Buddhism, or is there something else there that I'm not seeing?
No, it is an exception. I would even put it earlier than the 10th century. I think there was, you see, when Buddhism went to China, it went into a country that already had a long and highly refined artistic traditions in poetry, in painting, calligraphy, architecture. Many fields of creative work were already highly developed in China. So the Buddhists from India found themselves in a very developed culture. Buddhism was appealing to the Chinese because it addressed certain spiritual needs that were not being met by the Taoist or the Confucian traditions. But Buddhism was able to introduce into China. And what happened as a result, as Buddhism was embraced by the Chinese, the Buddhists, the Buddhists brought the new Chinese Buddhists brought with them their own aesthetic traditions, their own poetic traditions, literary traditions, painting, and so forth and so on. And so what happened in China was that uh, making art was not seen as something separate from the practice of the Dharma. And this is the only, I think it's really the only, it's mainly in East Asian traditions and particularly Zen that we find that the practice of calligraphy or tea ceremony or whatever it is actually considered part of Buddhism. It's not as though the art is making religious icons that you can then put up in the temple. It's actually each individual working with their imagination, with their hands, with their eyes, with their senses in in drinking tea, doing calligraphy, whatever it might be. And that I feel is an exception. Buddhism has tended to not include artistic practice as something integral to the Dharma, but something somewhat to the side. Be an interesting question to ask Mathieu Ricard with his photography. Does he see this as a practice of the Dharma, or does he see it as a hobby or something? I'd be interested to know the answer. Can we move on to the next one? Nava.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephen. Just to say that your work has been very inspiring, and I wanted to ask you about engaged engage Buddhism, engage Dharma, activism, and maybe even the Bodhisattva path, I find that to be engaged in the world as and doing the Buddhist practice really requires to be in the content of mind and be able to use creativity and imagination to try to think of pathways to deal with the wicked problems that we are facing. So can you say something about that? Because for me, this talk was really some kind of a bridge between the two worlds I'm trying to bridge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. If I understand you, then I agree with you. And that is that I feel that one of the things that has perhaps held Buddhism back from being more engaged in the world is because it doesn't valorize imagination and creativity so much. Or when it is uses it, it thinks of it primarily as making art, for example, or making beautiful temples, or whatever it may be. But I think what imagination and creativity do is actually open our minds to examine not just our own personal experience, but to become more sensitized to the suffering of others. And I think this is a natural consequence of basically being mindful, of being paying greater attention, noticing more carefully, not only oneself, but others' feelings, those close to you, those at your workplace, and animals and human beings across the world. And the Bodhisattva path is clearly a move within the history of the Buddhist tradition to somehow to reignite the value of compassion. And the Bodhisattva is very much a person who's, in a way, breaking out of the rather ascetic, renunciant model that had become dominant in early Buddhism and sought to re-engage with the world. And so I don't think it's surprising, therefore, that you will find in Mahayana literature a much richer sort of, a much richer language in some ways. Like you take the Flower Garland Sutra, for example. This is it's a brilliantly evocative Buddha, pure lands of Buddhas and Buddhas all over the universe and so on. That kind of imaginative feat is, I think, in a way, a celebration of no longer being tied to this rather austere tradition of self-involvement. But at the same time, I think that without exercising the imagination, without really asking, well, what can Buddhism say to, let's say, climate change or the conflict in Israel and Gaza, or whatever it might be, it's not really, I think, particularly helpful for Buddhists to say, well, we should be non-violent and we should be kind and we should be wise and, all this sort of thing. But I think we're finding ourselves asking questions for which Buddhism often doesn't have an answer. What would be a Buddhist position on the situation in Gaza, for example? The Buddhist community as a whole has been somewhat wrong-footed by this. They don't quite know what to say. I don't quite know what to say. I'm struggling with this too. But I feel more and more as we live in more and more of a global village, we can't ignore these events that are occurring elsewhere in the world. And we need to, I think, evolve not just an engaged Buddhism, because engaged Buddhism is a phrase that to me is already an acknowledgement of failure. In other words, it's suggesting that Buddhism is basically disengaged, and we really need to sort of ramp up the engagement more. And that suggests, I think, that something got disengaged in the Dharma. Now, that's a big question to ask why or how, but I feel it has quite a lot to do with the emphasis on meditation, the emphasis on monasticism, which is all about a withdrawal from the world. And I feel as the Dharma engages with modernity, engages with a rather non-monastic community. I don't know if there are any monks or nuns in this group. I don't see any. then I think these questions become more and more urgent. And I think they are actually, in a sense, there is a call from this suffering to the Buddhist community for a response. And I don't think that response has been very forthcoming. I've actually been trying to articulate a response to some of these issues in what I've been writing recently, but I've actually found it very difficult because I feel there's something. I'm not quite convinced that Buddhism traditionally has the skill sets that can be, as it were, scaled up to address social and political and global issues from a tradition that has been primarily concerned with the well-being of the individual and with the sanghas and communities. And that, I think, is a call for imagination. Where that will lead, I don't know.
So I just want to say that I'm from Israel,
Yeah.
and I really feel that I don't see in international Buddhist teachers right now, and I don't see really the imagination and creativity required to support what's happening here right now. And I see major collapses. I call it cognitive collapses, and I really think that this is a call for another evolution
Yeah.
that's required. Yeah.
I
So
can,
I would be happy to be in touch with you through Keren Arbel, maybe. Thank you very much. Your work really supports me right now.
oh, well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say that, Nava. And no, I have enormous sympathy for what you're going through in Israel at the moment, both through Karen Arbel, whom I'm in contact with, and others. And we are, in fact, trying to put together a forum of Buddhist teachers from the West and the East too, perhaps, to actually stand back and look at this issue of yours. And that's something hopefully that might develop later this year or early next year. But I'm working on that.
Yeah, I'm updated. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you.
you, Nava.
Yeah.
Amy, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen, for this totally amazing talk. But also my thought is it was a little bit in relationship to what was just said. I was thinking about what you said about imagination and creativity involving danger,
Mm-hmm.
and know, I guess you could say radical creativity is scandalous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what makes poetic language poetic, and so I'm saying this. I can't remember in detail your book, but I'm wondering if in the response that you gave to Nava, and the search for something that questions or highlights or foregrounds the danger that's involved with creativity, and maybe that's why it was repressed because of the doctrines and all that. But it seems to me that you gave an answer in another of your much earlier books called Living with the Devil. And you said, where the Buddha is, Mara is never far away.
Yeah.
So that, for me, that book in its mixed, and again, I didn't reread it in preparation for your talk, but it brings out this notion that of this yin and yang, or these opposites, and it might speak also to pathologies of good and evil, like polarization. So that's what I was thinking about when you were answering the last question.
Thank you, Amy. As you're speaking, I was actually thinking of Francisco's teacher, Chogyam Trungpa. He's a very divisive figure these days. But Trungpa, although I never met Trungpa, he was always kind of the lodestar in my journey through Tibetan Buddhism. And mainly because he was an artist. I think the thing that really impressed me about Trungpa was his imagination, his creativity, and his willingness to take risk, and his willingness to be totally dangerous. I think that's not a strange thing to say. And I feel that is the case. I think what did you said the radical creativity is scandalous and dangerous, and I think it is. I think it can be, and so I would, I'm slightly wary of when Buddhism gets too puritanical and becomes too much, on about, keeping to all the right doctrines and all of the right steps along the path and following all the rules and so on. There's certainly a place for all of that. I mean, that's where I tend to incline myself. But I feel that can that can actually leave the tradition rather dead. It's often people who are willing and have the courage to somehow break out of that. Someone like Naropa, for example. I mean, the story of Naropa and some of the other Mahasiddhas in India in the 10th century, and you'll find exactly the same going on in China with the emergence of Zen. Zen Buddhism, when it broke out in China in about, well, let's say 7th, 8th century AD, it was scandalous. Some of the stuff that these Zen masters were saying, it was really, really shocking. Who is the Buddha? Oh, the Buddha is just an old Indian beggar. What is the enlightenment? Go and wash your mouth out. Stuff like this. Use of it's very, very provocative. It's very, very engaged, and it really wants to shake you up. And I do think the Dharma and any philosophy worth its mettle, frankly, if it's not shocking you, you haven't really understood it. You find this with my teacher Geshe Rabten said this about emptiness once. He said, um, if you don't find the idea of emptiness shocking, then you clearly haven't understood it. The fact that there is no essential nature to anything, for example, that's again a shocking thing to say. We could go on and on, but I'm
Thank
glad
you.
you brought that up. That's fantastic. Wolfgang, you have a question, and this is probably going to have to be the last one. Or Joanna, are we okay? Can we keep going?
Yeah, we're fine. I think we can have time for just one more question. So that's perfect. If we'll end with Wolf.
Okay, Wolfgang, it's lovely to see you.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And having read your new book,
Ah, you've
uh,
read it.
I wondered about imagination. I looked into the dictionary and I found both meanings. Does imagination mean imagining an object
No,
or the power to imagine the
um,
object?
I would say the power too, uh,
Both.
but both in a way. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Then this is clear. Thank you.
all right, good.
That was just what I wanted to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Joanna.
Okay, well, I think this is the time when I would love for us just to collectively, even though we're all on Zoom, just give you a round of applause and really thank you, Stephen, for this exquisite and I would even say panoramic offering around creativity, imagination, and all things aesthetic. And so thank you as well for giving us a little bit of a sneak peek into your recent book, which was just published in August. So for those who are interested, it's out from Yale University Press. And I hope you'll come back and speak to us more. And because you have so many facets to share, I think we can probably even invite you back for a different facet, and we will really be happy to continue the conversation. So thanks again, Stephen, and thanks to everyone
Thank you.
who attended and
Thank
all
you.
of this evening. And I think we just have an end slide to share for those who want to follow some of our upcoming programs. There we go. So for those who would like, speaking of practice, we do have a monthly practice session, which is a lightly guided and sharing circle online every month. So you're welcome to join that. The next one is on Tuesday, the 30th of September. It's open really to anyone, any level of experience, any type of practice. So please feel free to join us. We always like to see new faces there. The next talk in the series mentioned in the chat will actually be Mathieu Ricard himself, speaking about his most recent book, which is coming out called Painting with Light. And I think in French, the title is Lumière. So if you're interested in, once again, these intersections between the contemplative and the artistic and aesthetic, I think this will be a great continuation of this, of what we've just talked about this evening. So that's, again, open to everyone. Feel free. be sure to register early. We'll send around the link in our newsletter fairly soon. And I do want to make a plug for the next online talk. We don't have it on the slide here, but we're actually going to have Jay Garfield on the 29th of October. And for those who are familiar with Buddhist scholarship, Jay is one of the great voices in Buddhist scholarship, and he's worked a great deal on original text, and he's just done 2 different translations actually, and so 2 books have come out. He will be presenting those books. It's part of a new book launch series that we've started at Mind and Life Europe, and there will be ample time for discussion. So we really hope that you'll join us for that on the 29th of October. And last but not least, we have our European Varela Award cycle that'll be opening on October 27th. And for those who don't know about that, this is one of the scholarship fellowship opportunities that we're able to offer at Mind and Life Europe for those working of science. So you can visit our website for more information. I think that's enough for me. So with that, thanks again, Stephen. Thanks everyone, and have a really good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you find yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.